We might as well get started. So as I said today, last class of actual material. So last official type lecture thing. And again, just to reemphasize, it's the last class of official lecture stuff, but this is not even testable, for the semester of fall 2020. If I ever use this in a future semester, it may be testable. But nonetheless, just put that out there. So basically what we're going to do today is we're going to continue on the same theme of question that we explored last lecture on Tuesday, where we took a look at invariably what was a quantitative technique to provide guidance on the right level of capital structure, right? That technique that we developed at the end of, or that we presented at the end of class in our last lecture, right? We had called the technique WACC minimization, right? Where we were trying to figure out at what level of leverage, right? At what level of leverage would we have the lowest WACC we possibly could have? This was admittedly an imperfect exercise because we had to answer a bunch of hypothetical what if questions. What if my leverage was 20%? What would my WACC be? What if my leverage was 40%? What would my WACC be? Right? Because look, in principle, as we discussed in topic 1, the only one that we can actually make a fairly rigorous attempt to answer is not the what if, it's we have 25% leverage. Given that 25% leverage, we estimate that our WACC is this. Every other leverage level involves a leap of faith where we had to make some assumptions. And we went over those assumptions last lecture. And that gave us a technique, right? A quantitative technique for picking our optimal leverage, right? Now, let's also remember that that was an imperfect technique. It was an imperfect technique because minimizing WACC is not the same thing as maximizing value. And we generally build all of our decision-making apparatus in finance around the notion of value maximization. So if this technique does not involve value maximization, it is partially at odds with what we believe the right thing to do is, right? So imperfect technique, right? But what I should point out is that WACC minimization is currently the most commonly used approach in practice for guiding the capital structure decisions, in particular leverage for companies. It is still the most commonly used. It's the most commonly used because it's really the only one that didn't seem super ad hoc in terms of like just over anchoring to one specific theory of the costs and benefits of debt and then really being hand wavy on doing stuff. There's an element of rigor in the exercise that we had presented last lecture. And so even though it's imperfect, it's the closest to legit that was available to us for a very extended period of time. Right? But again, we point out that it is ignoring certain things that are relevant, right? And the most basic way to think about it is that WACC minimization ignores the fact that when you change leverage, you also change expected cash flows, right? For a variety of reasons. Because of risk shifting. There's also another cost of debt that we did not talk about in our last lecture, but that you guys probably saw in finance too, which is debt overhang. When you have a lot of debt and you start to get in trouble, it becomes difficult for you to fund new projects that are positive NPV. Because if you are equity that is underwater, you know that some of that benefit of the new project doesn't go to you, it goes to debt. And what debt gets may more than offset the value of the project and leave you worse off as equity, right? And there's versions, there's actually a bunch of different wrinkles to debt overhang, but that's the basic idea, right? And so what that means is that we can also lose opportunities to make good investments because of the overhang of our debt, right? So when I listed like costs prior to financial distress, so prior to bankruptcy, right? I had mentioned risk shifting. I just mentioned another one, debt overhang. There's a large list of different versions of these things, right? That just kind of reemphasizes that it's kind of difficult for us to make an attempt as outsiders to lay out all of the considerations that are relevant. Can we kind of agree with that? Right? So basically, in some sense, WACC minimization says we can't do it. Let's kind of ignore it. I mean, that's literally what it does, because it ignores the effect of leverage on expected cash flows. Like, that's by definition ignoring it, right? Some other people try to do these really, really ad hoc, fishy looking things where they're like, let me build a model of the cost of debt overhang. Like, honestly, you know, I would never use those models. They just, too many leaps of faith there, too much taking a simple model seriously. Like, I'm not into that. So I'm not even going to make an attempt to present that to you. By the way, I've never seen an investment banker make an attempt to even read the model to decide how they would use it, right? So like, I don't take it seriously. They don't, they do that even less, they take it even less seriously than I do, right? So then the question is, okay, well, fine. This is really difficult. And we have a technique that involves ignoring a bunch of stuff. I mean, that doesn't seem super satisfactory. How else could we go about doing it? And the second approach that I'm going to be presenting to you actually takes a pretty clever approach to trying to tackle this problem. The approach is called the Graham approach. I call it the Graham approach, to be honest. It's not, there's no official term to this methodology. I call it the Graham approach because it's the person who developed the technique, who's kind of most central to having developed the technique, because it built off of years of different research that he did. So it builds off of stuff he did by himself. And then this last little step, which is an important step, so I don't want to dismiss it, kind of took his stuff, and then couple of other people came in and helped, put a bow on it, kind of thing. That's why because it would be a mouthful to call it the Graham Van Binsbergen / person X that I don't remember technique. So I just call it the Graham approach. John Graham's a nice guy. He's a professor at Duke. Let me tell you guys what the technique is about. It's actually pretty clever. It's based off of the following idea, a general idea that can be applied in settings beyond just the setting that we're applying here. It's an economic principle called revealed preferences. So revealed preferences, when I decide, when I'm presented an option, choose black Muji pen or orange Muji pen, and I pick black, one thing is that I think black has a higher benefit minus cost than orange, right? That teaches me something about the cost benefit curve of this item and the cost benefit curve of that item, right? Or when someone decides to go to McGill instead of University of Toronto or McGill South, right? They reveal that they think, the benefit over cost of McGill exceeds that of the other things. When you see thousands of people making decisions and you think there's some rhyme and reason that connects those decisions, you can actually learn a lot about the nature of benefits and costs of different goods, right? So why? Because we think people make at least somewhat sensible decisions, right? Now, let's think about this in the context of capital structure. I see companies pick capital structure. I see that Six Flags from last lecture, Six Flags circa 2006, which is when I had pulled that data, they basically had 27% leverage, something to that order, right? That means they thought 27% was better than 28%, and also better than 26%. Make sense? Right? So I'm just going to draw something. because I always think of this as a cost benefit analysis problem. I always try to boil down a decision-making problem into an accounting of benefits and costs, tabulation of those things, and optimizing the gap so that if you've got a decision, you've got a decision on the x-axis, right? And you've got, let's call it marginal cost and marginal benefit on the y-axis, right? I just say to myself, look, so you guys know the notion of a marginal benefit and a marginal cost, correct? Right, it's the derivative of the cost and the benefit curve, right? So if I've got marginal benefit that looks so I generally think of a picture like this. It's not necessarily always a straight line. I'm just drawing the simplest thing possible here. But you've got a marginal benefit curve where the less you do of a it's kind of like, let's see, let me think of a problem that my son thinks about a lot, which is how much chocolate should I eat, right? That first bite of chocolate is fabulous. The marginal benefit, right? Super high. He keeps eating chocolate. Okay, I haven't actually empirically validated this, but I suspect it starts getting less good the more he eats. That's the marginal benefit curve. What about the marginal cost? At some point you start getting more and more full. The more and more full, it's less and less pleasurable to eat. Well, there's also health effects, but I'm not sure he quite comprehends those yet. And by the way, his perception of the costs are what matters for his decision. Well, that and also daddy's rules, but that's a side thing, not in this figure. So like marginal cost goes up and up and up, right? The consequences of the decision get worse and worse as you make more of it, and the marginal benefit of it kind of starts to fall, right? Diminishing marginal utility, for instance, right? And so the more of a decision, well, which decision do you make? You keep on adding more of this thing, right? More chocolate, so long as the marginal benefit of more chocolate exceeds the marginal cost. But the moment the marginal cost is higher than the marginal benefit, you're like hurting yourself by having more chocolate, right? And so what's the optimal thing to do? Right, the optimal thing to do is to pick your decision. Here, let's move away from chocolate now and go back to what ACF is about, which is leverage, right? You keep on adding leverage, you add more debt, right? So long as the marginal benefit of adding a little more debt exceeds the marginal cost. Right, so you get something like this. So, if we believe that corporations pick things smartly, right? They should be doing this. Do we agree? Now, here's the thing. This is nice, but the problem is I don't know these curves, right? So I simplify things. I've got marginal benefit, marginal cost. I'm going to change things a little bit. And by the way, what's important is that okay, I'm learning to work with the light here. So I could actually move some costs into and account for them as negative benefits and things like that, right? So I can kind of move things from one block to the other just by, right? Because it's like marginal benefit equals marginal cost. I can move some stuff from one side of the equation to the other, okay? I'm actually going to take some benefits and move them into costs, because here, look, there's a practical reason. It doesn't make sense yet, I'm realizing in real time, but it'll make sense shortly. So I'm going to call this marginal benefit tax, MBT. That means it's only that, remember I had listed 3 benefits. I said there were tax benefits and then there was some other categorizations of benefits. This is only the tax part. And then I'm going to call this marginal cost N. So marginal net cost, which is going to be the marginal cost minus all the marginal non-tax benefits of debt. So anything that's not a tax benefit, I'm rolling it into this as a negative. There's actually a very practical reason for why I'm doing this, by the way. The practical reason for that is I will be able to measure this curve with real world data. Okay, so it turns out there are techniques for approximating what the marginal benefit of taxes associated with issuing more debt. It's actually not even that complicated, but all we need to know for the purposes of our discussion here is that this number here, we've got it. Like this I can estimate. So I'm actually going to put this in blue, right? So like this is actually, there's a beauty to this whole exercise. Can you guys see that it's blue? No, right? No? Okay, well, I learned now. This line here, we can actually compute this line with real world data. So we know it. So what I mean is we know it. The problem is we have no clue what this line looks like. It is not observable, right? That was the whole point. It's like there are all these, costs that are impossible to measure, or impossible for us as outsiders to measure, let's say, right? All those benefits are, all those non-tax benefits are difficult to measure. That leaves us in a pickle. Okay? But here's the thing. This is pretty clever. What do I observe in the real world? I observe this. I'm able to measure out the curve, and I observe the decision of leverage that this company made. Do we agree with that? This actually does tell me something. I don't know what the cost curve is, right? But I know that it must pass through that point. So there's a lot of things that are ruled out. The problem is there's a lot of stuff that isn't ruled out as well. Like the curve could look like this, right? This is not a cat with whiskers, okay? But you can see, right? I just drew 3 lines. All 3 of them are consistent with that decision, right? So I don't know which of those 3 lines is the one, right? Here's a pretty clever thing that was done. Graham and his co-authors looked at a change in tax code. So they looked to see when the tax code changes, how does leverage change, right? Well, when the tax code changes, what it changes is the marginal benefit of tax, but it doesn't change the other things. So when the tax code changes, we're also able to measure how the MBT line changes. So I'll call this MBT old tax regime. Right, so MBT under the old tax regime. And then taxes change. And I see I can now compute the curve under the new tax regime. Right, I can now calculate this. You guys see what I'm saying? And then I wait for the company to change their leverage. They change their leverage, and when they change their leverage, they pick this one. Guess what? I know my line now. So I have now picked out my line, my marginal cost net line. And what this really is it's a line that was revealed by the choices of the company. Well, this is a line. Now, of course, we can all say, it's probably not really a line. It's probably a curve. Sure, fair point, right? Our goal is not to get the perfect curve, but our goal is to get the best line we can get. So we get this line for one company, but we also go get the line for a bunch of other companies. And then we try to make sense of that line using regression analysis. And that gives us a regression model, a formula for this line that seems most consistent with the overall decisions of companies in the financial market. You guys see what I'm saying? Again, it's not about understanding the details. It's about understanding the spirit, right? What Graham and company have done is they have exploited a change in the tax code. It is a change from a little while back. It's a change from 1986 because there was a major change in the corporate tax code in the United States then. It is the cleanest place to see that stuff in action, right? And then from there, they projected out a formula for this line, okay? And it's a formula that, if interpreted literally, can be used to get that curve for any company. And then once they have that curve, you now know how to get the marginal benefit curve. You now know how to get the marginal cost curve. You just find the intersection point. And that's what that technique involves doing. I'm just going to show it to you guys with some pictures. Okay. I just need to, okay, this is the one. You guys see my my slides? So first of all, this I'm sure looks a little bit overwhelming when you look at it. This is actually the regression result of the Graham paper. There's a lot of numbers here. I only want us to focus on the last column here. Each column is a different regression analysis to generate a formula for the cost curve. Okay. The one that, oh yeah, I just want to make sure, the one that I think is most, oh, you know what? I'm going to just focus us on this one. Okay, so there's different versions of it, but I just focus on the simplest one for the purposes of this class. Here's the way you read this curve. The way Graham and his co-authors estimate the curve is they make an assumption that the slope of the marginal cost curve, that slope is the same for every company in the world. This is not obvious when you look at this, but their measure of leverage is this thing called IOB, which is interest divided by book assets. Right? The more interest per unit of book asset you're paying, probably the more debt you have. Right? So the higher this number is, the more leverage you have. Right? And the relationship is such that the marginal cost goes up by 4.733 per every unit that IOB goes up. Now, remember, IOB is a tiny number. But in any case, it's 4.733 for every line. So the slope of this line, the slope of the orange line is the same for every company in their model. And then the intercept is going to be different from company to company. But the formula for the intercept is linear. So that the intercept is equal to a constant plus this number times collateral, a measure for collateral, plus this number times a measure of size. This is the log of total assets, the natural log of total assets, plus this number times the book to market ratio, right? So book equity divided by market equity, plus this number times a measure of intangible assets, plus this number times a measure of how much cash flow you have, how much of a cash cow you are, plus this number times a dummy variable of whether you pay dividends or not. Now, you don't have a ton of context for why in the world those variables were put in, but look, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go deep into that. The model is what it is, but there is a sensibility to the variables that were tossed in there, because those are variables that relate to things that we think are relevant for the costs, right? Like, what do you think happens to the marginal cost of debt if you've got a lot of collateral? Do you think it goes up or it goes down? It goes down, right? Right. Collateral makes it easier for you to get a loan, right? That's why you can borrow a lot of money to buy a house, because that's pretty good collateral. Well, they get an appraisal done, and if the appraisal looks good, that's good collateral. They're willing to lend you a high percentage, right? But on other things where there's no collateral, there's much less willingness to do so, or they charge a higher rate. Correct? By the way, this is exactly reflected in this regression result. The more collateral you have, right? The more collateral you have, the lower the intercept of your marginal cost curve. Let's think about what happens here. The more collateral you have, let's say this is, whoops, sorry about that. Let's say this is like with low collateral. Well, what would happen to this curve with high collateral? The curve would now go like this. It would shift downwards because it would have a lower intercept. And when it shifts downwards, are you going to have more debt or less debt? More debt, right? Because you still take the intersection. So if we're still in the new tax regime, you're going to pick here, right? And your new leverage under more collateral is going to be higher. See what I'm saying? Like, that makes a lot of sense, right? Oh, I just realized that you saw me in a very small box. I'm sorry about that. Give me 1 second. Stop share. Let's do that one again. So I just said, this is with low collateral. All of a sudden, manna from the heavens, more collateral. Because you have more collateral now, your curve has gone down because you have a lower intercept. Sorry, yeah, intercept, that's right. When I say intercept, I mean like, the intercept onto this, right? Because a line is A plus BX. So when I say intercept, I mean the A in A plus BX. But we're still looking at crossing this curve under the new regime. So now it crosses here, and this represents an increase in leverage relative to before. So my point is, it makes sense. The same can be said with all of the other stuff. It almost all makes sense. Maybe I'll pick one other example just to highlight that. I'm going to go back to sharing my slide. Can you guys see my slide again? All right, so let's take another one, book to market. When someone talks about book to market, what do you think about? You might also, that the flip side is market to book, right? So something that has a high market to book ratio, that means it's the market value of equity trades at a premium to the book value of the equity. What do you usually think about a company like that? What's the first thing that you think about that company? You think it's going to be high growth or low growth?
High growth.
It's going to be high growth. It's that growth. Remember, because remember, book equity is not forward looking. market equity is forward looking. So when market equity is high relative to something that's not forward looking, it's probably because the forward looks nice. Which probably means there's nice growth or nice profits on the horizon, right? So that's generally what I think about, right? Companies that have a high market to book ratio have a lot of growth opportunities, right? Meaning if they have a lot of growth opportunities, those are the companies where layering themselves with debt can become a problem because they have all these things that they'd like to do, but the debt gets in the way. So a company with a high market to book ratio, would you expect it to have a high marginal cost or a low marginal cost? A high marginal cost, right? Because all of a sudden now, if they have a bunch of debt, they might be forced to like give up on those things, right? Well, remember, high market to book means what? A low book to market. So if you have a low book to market, you should have a high marginal cost, which is why this is negative. So that actually makes sense. There's really only one here that doesn't make any sense to me from a purely rational standpoint. And it's the cash flow one. If you have a lot of cash, do you think you should be able to have more debt or less debt? You should be willing to take more debt, right? It's like I should be willing to get a bigger mortgage when I have a higher income, right? This regression result tells you one thing that's weird because it says the higher your cash flow, the higher your marginal cost. And when the higher your marginal cost, that means you have less debt. So companies that are cash cows, in the data, what this is telling you is that they have less debt. Right? So a couple of things. This actually does a nice way zoning into like an assumption of this approach and introducing the question of whether we believe that assumption or not. If we interpret this curve as the true correct cost curve, literally what we're assuming is that everyone makes the right decision, or on average, at least people make the right decision. Right? So like literally the cost curve is just a translation device. It's almost like a comparables analysis. When I use this cost curve, I'm trying to make my decision as close to comparables as possible. I'm like, other people did it this way, I'll kind of do it that way. That's, this is just like a more nerdy mathematical way to do that. So far, so good? Well, just like any other comparables-based analysis, if everyone else is making a mistake, you're going to carbon copy that mistake. See what I'm saying? So if you use this curve this way, and this number here is not a sign of making the right choice, but is actually the sign of making a mistake, then you're just copying the mistake when you use this parameter. But here's a neat thing. I don't need to copy that parameter. If I think that's a mistake, I can tweak the formula and remove the mistake. I'm like, you know what? They do this well, they do this well, they do this well, they do this well. Might as well use all those numbers. They do this shit poor. Screw it. I'm replacing this with like maybe at least I replace it with a 0 because I don't think I should have less debt when I have more cash flow. Right? I actually might want to replace it with a negative number because I'm like, you know what? Actually, it's the opposite. I think that when I have more cash coming, I should be willing to take more debt. Now, of course, we all realize we're doing this. Oh, wait, you guys can only see me in small again. But my point is, When we replace this number with something else, it's ad hoc, it's qualitative, it's a judgment call, right? But I actually trust my judgment call of plugging in a 0 more than I do plugging in the 8%. Like, I know that that's taking me closer to the right decision because I know that the parameter is probably negative. The only thing with plugging in a negative is I'm worried I over-adjusted. Are we okay with this? But this highlights something else that's pretty cool. One second, Ashley. It highlights the fact that we can look at this, and when we qualitatively reason through whether we believe the results or not, we can tweak the formula to reflect what we perceive are mistakes by the masses of CFOs, right? So that's actually pretty neat, right? This technique is laid out so logically that we can actually start thinking about what do we trust about the data and what do we not trust about it. So I actually, when I teach this course and there's more time, I first introduce the standard, what I call the standard gram approach, which is just use the formula as given. And then I talk about ways to modify the gram approach to incorporate your own qualitative views about stuff. And what I just described, change this coefficient from plus 0.08 to 0 is an example of modifying it, but modifying it in a way where you can logically defend your choice. And where you actually believe by making the tweak, you get a better decision. That's a good thing. By the way, there's another tweak that I like to talk about, again, when I have more time. And actually, even in a normal year, it's hit or miss whether I talk about it. But I also have a technique that's implementable in practice where we can think about tweaking the slope to allow different companies to have different slopes. In particular, I think that the slope should be higher for companies that have high volatility, right? In some sense, right, the slope shouldn't be super high. If you're the most predictable company in the world, I mean, it's no biggie to add debt. But if you're like a super unpredictable company, just even adding a little bit of debt can add a lot of pain. Does that make sense logically? So I have ways where even if we don't have their data set, if we just make our own little test mini data set that's more feasible for us to do in practice, we can actually estimate how that slope changes, which is pretty cool as far as I'm concerned. Right? So that's part of the beauty of the gram approach, right? So I love that the gram approach really boils down the decision-making process to like first principles, marginal benefit and marginal cost. I love their really wonderful insight that you can take advantage of a tax code change to go and opportunistically estimate what that cost curve looks like. And I love that you can level up what they did with your own judgment to decide how you tweak their formula. Right? And there's a lot of clarity every step of the way there. So that's what I really like about the gram approach. Look, I'm not going to go over implementing this technique, even though the spreadsheet I gave you actually has you guys, like has an example where you actually do it, right? It's just, in the interest of time, we don't have the time to do that. That's like a 2-lecture exercise normally. And given that this is not being tested and given that the technique itself is only slowly starting to be used in practice. So by the way, it is starting to be, actually one of my friends uses it. He works in technology investment banking and he's used this exercise to try to convince technology companies that they should hold more debt, right? Especially technology companies that are generating reasonable profits, right? So he's used it to make the case. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But he basically did it because, you know, he wanted to create a new line of business within the investment bank, especially during a period where IPO activity in the technology sector was going down. Obviously, it's back up this year. But there was a period of time where there was actually surprisingly few tech IPOs. So investment bankers had to find other ways to make money. And so he, found one way to introduce a new insight to try to, systematically walk through the decision-making process of optimal capital structure to a CFO. And actually, there's something really nice about this technique is it actually is pretty nice in terms of walking someone through the decision, right? Because it brings it all back down to first principles. Like it's a lot easier, I think, for me to convince someone that this exercise makes sense than for me to convince someone that WACC minimization makes sense. Because WACC minimization is like, where exactly does WACC come from? Do I believe the way you've calculated it? Wait a second, isn't there other, like, doesn't debt like change what I can do? Are you factoring this out? If a CFO asks me that question, I have two options. I tell him, no, it doesn't factor it, in which case he's probably not satisfied. Or I say, yes, it does factor it, and I have just lied, right? Like this just feels more comprehensive. The moment a CFO says, wait a second, Jiro, like, how can this measure everything? My response is, well, actually, look, we can't ever measure everything, but this implicitly measures absolutely everything that the average CFO can measure. So anything is kind of reflected into this. And so then basically I've put the thing back right in his face, maybe in a nice way, but like saying like, yeah, if you think that's not enough, then you think you're not enough is basically what I'm saying. Right. And then all I have to do is coach him through or coach him or her through, this idea that there might be systematic mistakes. And then, of course, the way that I would present that to the CFO is I would say, look, this is actually not a reflection of exactly your decision. It's the reflection of the average CFO. And look, I know you would never make this mistake, but it turns out the average CFO makes a couple of mistakes. One mistake that the average CFO makes is that when they've got a lot of cash, they mysteriously choose to have less debt. The reason is they don't need the debt. When you have a lot of cash, you don't need debt. But just because you don't need it doesn't mean you shouldn't have it. Why should you have it? Because the more debt you have, the more goodies the government gives to you. We want to maximize your goodies, right? So you can tell them the story, and while at the same time saying like, but I know you would never make that mistake. So let's get rid of that mistake from the calculations. And then they're like, oh, finally, someone understands me. Someone understands how awesome I am and how I don't make mistakes, right? But that's kind of like the way you do that conversation, right? This actually really blends well for financial advisory, where you are doing something very important in the advisor-client relationship, which is that you guide them through the decision, right? It also allows you to ask them, like, look, are there ways that you think you're particularly weird compared to the average company? And as they tell you that, then you can think about how you want to do other tweaks. Like maybe what they'll say is, our company, the way you measure collateral is really different from the way you measure collateral for other companies. Like the moment they tell me that, I'm going to think about like, okay, I'm not going to measure collateral the way Graham and his co-authors measured it. I'm going to listen to what he says, and I'm going to try to see if I can measure collateral that way. And then I'll plug in that X variable here instead, right? So then they feel like you're really customizing to them, right? This is like what is it? White glove? Whatever it is. It's the premium service, right? If a CFO thinks you offer a premium service and everyone else offers what should be freemium, then, but that they charge you the same price, they charge them the same price. I think most people holding price fixed prefer the premium to the freemium, right? Right? It's kind of little tricks like that. That's what I love about this technique. I just think I believe that this technique will disseminate over the next 10 to 15 years because it just works. In advisory, yeah, I don't know. I just, I think the people who are still using WACC minimization are like baboons. So it's just kind of like, it's just, they only do it because that's the way it's always been done. Right? Like, no, look, let me say one thing, which is I don't ignore WAC minimization. I view it as a data point as well. Right? And so I might pick something between this answer and WAC minimization. I'm not sure. It'll depend on the circumstances. I'm going to ask myself the question, how bad do I think WAC minimization is screwing up? If I think it's screwing up quite a bit, then I probably will put very little weight on it. If I think like, this is not a company that's likely to have a lot of debt overhang and stuff like that, then I'm going to start thinking about one versus the other a little bit more. That's how I go about doing it. By the way, there's actually one other killer benefit of the Graham approach. So this is an example, Graham approach. Marginal benefit curve, marginal cost curve. Optimal choice is this, correct? Let's say the company has chosen B instead of A. Do they have too little debt or too much debt? Pretty obvious. They have too little debt, correct? Likewise, if they've chosen C, they have too much debt. So far, so good? This is pretty amazing. Do you see the area between these two curves? What does that represent by definition? I could have had this benefit net of this cost. The difference between these two numbers is a marginal surplus that I could have created, correct? Plus this marginal surplus, plus this marginal surplus, plus this some. This is how much value I am missing out on from having had too little debt. The way that they define their figures, this is a bit of a nitty-gritty comment, is that this is an annualized number. So if you take the area under the curve, it gives you a percentage. And the way you read that percentage is the percent of book assets that is destroyed as value annually because of the fact that you have too little debt. And so you can calculate this area, multiply that by your book assets, and that gives you a dollar number. That dollar number is how much money, how much value are you destroying this year because you have too little debt? And then you can go and say, well, how much will you destroy next year, the year after that, the year after that? And then you can just string along the discounted values, take the present value, and you get a number. And you say, look, if I move you to the optimal capital structure, we are adding this much value to your company. How cool is that? You can literally say, we think you should make this decision. And if you listen to us, we have added, $274 million in value to your company. Like, this is not something that emerges from a WAC minimization, by the way. So to me, that's like super cool. Right? And by the way, within the assumptions of the model, this is not a hand-wavy exercise. This is a theorem. So it is rigorous. Right? So not only can you guide the CFO through the story, not only can you tailor the method to the nuances of the company, but when you've done all that stuff, you can tell them how much you help them. Like, to me, that's like premium service. If people believe that you did that, they believe that you've done an awesome job. They'll want to hire you again. That's what I think is such an amazing opportunity with a model like this. So that's my sales pitch for check it out. Try to decipher my spreadsheet in the future or something like that. But this is the second approach. Again, look, this approach is not perfect. Okay, let me be clear. I don't want to give you guys this mistaken impression that this is the most amazing thing ever ever done. To the extent that if you think CFOs just make mistakes left and right, then there's not much value to this exercise because you need to fix every decision, every part of their decision. Well, if you fix every part of their decision, you basically made the decision yourself, right? So you need to think there's at least some wiseness, in CFOs. I happen to believe that CFOs are generally pretty wise. To me, the big mistake is the cash flow thing, but I understand the temptation, right? Because if I can use the fact that I'm profitable to lower my debt, that helps me sleep better at night, even though it doesn't maximize value for my shareholders. Maybe I want to sleep better at night. Do I really blame them? I've been waking up at like 4 a.m. for a little while now. Like, I kind of would like to, wake up at 8 a.m. So I get it. So I can see where that happens, right? So it's not like when I see that mistake, I don't see someone who's dumb. I see someone who's conflicted. And you know what? All of us are conflicted in some ways periodically, right? None of us are always none of us pick all of our decisions to maximize shareholder maximize shareholder wealth, right? Or society utility. I wish we did, but we don't. None of us do. Certainly not myself. Right? But that's a pitfall of the thing. To the extent that there are systematic mistakes, you're going to carbon copy them. Another thing that's a bit of an issue in this model is that it did use things from 1986, right? And maybe the whole nature of like debt overhang, risk shifting, so on and so forth, was different then than it is now. In which case, the curve should look a bit different. That's important to remember, right? Just because a curve looked like this, back in the day, doesn't mean it looks like that today, right? So we want to think about how we can improve it over time. And when we see new opportunities to measure this curve, we should remeasure it. By the way, since 1986, there have been other changes to the tax code, corporate tax code, say in the US, that have been material. So there are other opportunities to update this curve. Now, what I will say is that I have not done that. As far as I know, John Graham and his co-authors have not done that either. So no one has really gone through that exercise, but there have been opportunities to do it. Yes, does someone have a question?
Yeah, I have a question just going back to the regression output. I was just wondering if you could touch on the intangible assets, because it seems like counterintuitive that if I had more tangible assets, it would increase my leverage.
The intangible assets part? Okay, you know what? Give me a second. I'm just going to pull up, because I'm going to pull up the exact definition of what it is. I just need to find my spreadsheet. Boom. Graham approach. Oh, shit. Okay, that's right. Yeah, so your question is intangible. Yeah, so I think intangible assets is another one where there's debate over. So it turns out like there are different views on how intangible assets should impact leverage. So this is one that's a little bit less clear theoretically. But let's see. So intangible assets. So more intangible assets. So what you're saying is intangible assets should make it more difficult to get debt.
Yeah, that's what I would think.
Yeah. So I mean that's a fair perspective. That's a fair perspective. Yeah. So I think that's fair. I think that one requires a little bit more careful thought. There's also this question of exactly what an intangible asset is, right? Like the word intangible, right? If I think of like the actual word itself and what it should mean, I completely agree with your statement. But the way it gets measured by accountants is not really that, right? So, so because of that, that introduces some complication here, is my basic point, right? To be honest, like to me, it's always been a mystery why capital structure regressions. Well, okay, no, it's not a mystery. There's a reason why it's in the regressions. It's because it shows up as a statistically significant coefficient. So in the data, it matters. It's just like theory doesn't clearly tell us whether it should be positive or negative because of the funkiness of the way it's measured, right? But so theoretically, it's a bit of a head spinner, right? Empirically, it matters. Whether this is a sign of mistake or not, to be honest, like I don't have like a super strong view personally. You will encounter people who have strong views, but I am not one of those people for here, right? I'm one of these people who has a very, very strong view here. And I'm a person who has a view that these three make sense and that this one makes sense, right? But let's think about it in a different way. We can quibble on whether we should tweak intangible. We probably all agree that we must tweak cash flow. But we probably all agree that this is still useful because we like call, LTA, BTM, and DDIV. Since those ones make sense, we know we should at least look into this. But reasonable people will defer on whether they adjust intangible or not. Like it's one where we can agree to disagree, and it's not obvious that one of us is like, you know, off in like cuckoo land.
No, that makes sense. I was just wondering because if this was done in like 86 and now in like 2020, like I think it's like 60% of the value in the S&P 500 is accounted for intangibles.
That's
And
great. Look, honestly, that is a really great observation. Honestly, that's great.
I think it'd be interesting to see.
100%, 100%. Look, Adam has actually highlighted something really nice here, which is there's something to be said about using your logic to ask yourself the question, what should I look at next? And what Adam has said is, look, the world has changed a lot since 1986, and this has shown up a lot in intangible assets. That's actually true, right? And because of that, what may have been viewed as a minor concern previously, so that we don't need to overinvest thought into it, may actually be now much more relevant and impactful on decisions than it was previously. So shouldn't we update to the new version of the world precisely because of this intangible asset thingy? That is like an amazing justification for wanting to update this. I agree with you 100%, Adam. So good job. Very good job. I like it. I'm probably still not going to update it because this is not one of the services that I offer through my consulting business, but but maybe I'll tell my friend Chris. I'll be like, Chris, you want to hire Adam? Do you have a job yet?
I don't have a job.
Oh shit. Email me.
Okay.
I'll tell my friend. I'm like, hey, someone came up with this brilliant thing, this very good justification for updating the stuff. You know, he may not be hiring, I don't know, but like he is running an entire tech investment banking group in the Bay Area. So yeah, because this is like the smartest thing that anyone has said about motivating, updating this information in all the years that I've taught this. So, you know, good on you. And in general, you've asked extremely good questions during the semester. So I've been very pleased with that. Anyway, in my slides, I actually even, you know, coach you guys a little bit through what's in the slides. So even though we're not going to go, in the spreadsheet. So even though we're not going to do it, I kind of lay it out. That can probably help accelerate if you ever want to learn it. Okay. I don't think me not showing you this in class is like leaving you at a shortfall relative to potential competitors in the labor market, because I also am very confident that I'm the only professor in the world who actually covers this in a course like this. For some reason, John Graham and Jules Van Binsbergen do not teach this in their course. I have told both of them that I think they should, but yeah. But you know, you guys have a preview here, and hopefully I've made a case for why like this is actually pretty cool. Like the level of sophistication and nuanced thinking in this method relative to WAC minimization right? You know, whack minimization, like intellectually, is like T-ball, you know, and like, you know, the thing, like, I think it's the version of baseball that people play when they're 4. Versus like, I don't know, like there's like real baseball. Is there like some movie that does like futuristic baseball? No. Okay, it doesn't exist. If there was such a movie, that version of baseball is like this thing. It's like not next level, it's like next level. It just like it blows the other one out of something. I don't know how the statement goes, but like it's just real. It's like a major. It's what we call a discontinuity in innovation, as far as I'm concerned. And it's a discontinuity where like the steps make sense. They make sense. We can poke holes in them, but you also see a path to fixing the holes. Meanwhile, like the hole for like whack minimization, I have no clue how to fix it, because it's just ignoring the stuff that's difficult to measure. And I'm like, well, just because it's difficult to measure doesn't mean we should ignore it, right? So yeah, so I am a big fan of this technique. Any questions? I mean, this pretty much summarizes what I wanted to say.
I just had a question. Because we can't trust the cash flow value, how do you know that the rest of the coefficients are accurate, even though they have like a logical positive or negative sign? How do you know that the actual value is like correct?
Yeah. So actually, that's a very good question too. So I think about this in 2 ways. So when I think about modifying the approach, there's like a hack version of modification, and then there's like a rigorous, you know, version of the modification. What I just described, replace the coefficient with 0, right? Or even the thing when I talk about changing the slope. Those are like hack modifications. What that means is they're modifications I can make without needing to collect a lot of data. The more serious modification would involve collecting all of the data, meaning like rebuilding the entire Graham Van Binsbergen / unknown person database, and then running the regressions, but running them in a way that are more general, to like go and properly adjust for all those things, right? Because what you're saying is, well, if we replace this with 0, if that number was actually 0 and we forced it to be 0, wouldn't that change the other coefficients? You're kind of thinking about like a multivariate regression. You know, it's not like the regression is just the univariate on one variable, take that coefficient, univariate on the other, because they all like interact with each other, right? And so you're saying like you can't just remove one and then assume the others just kind of stay the same. That's what you're saying, right? That's correct. That is correct, right? The thing is, I can't know how they will all change given that I make this one change without running the regression rigorously, which requires me to build a whole database. The thing is, that is a ginormous exercise, right? And so, you know, for the purposes of this class, I was never going to go and get that database. I'm not even going to try to ask the co-authors of that paper to give it to me, because I know the norms. It's not going to happen. They do consulting work with that data set, by the way, right? So I'm not going to ask. That means I have to build my own. I don't have the time, right? You know, and I can't write a Perl program to do it. So, so just out of practical reality, I've done the hack approach. But the hack approach is better than nothing as far as I'm concerned. But yeah, there is that alternative, which is like, do it seriously. And in fact, you know, in some sense, given what Adam proposed, you know, use the more modern changes in tax codes and rebuild that whole data set, because, you know, we really think the aspects related to intangible assets may very well change in a way that's quite material, right? If you take the Adam perspective, then you're really taking this perspective that like, no, there's no hacking around this thing. we got to do the rigorous rebuild. And this takes real resources. Like this is a 1-year project where we probably hire outsourced data collection help, maybe from India or from place where we can get it at an unfairly low price. And we devote some substantial effort on the part of our team to really kind of work through some of these things carefully. We probably hire John Graham or Jules Van Binsbergen to kind of help us knock these things out more rigorously, right? All of that stuff happens. That's like a real thing versus what I describe, which is like, we can kind of do it on the fly as a one-off to the CFO and stuff like that, right? So it's all kind of like, but Adam, like you've actually given, that is like the best argument I've heard so far on why we actually should do a rigorous rebuild. It's actually like, because in the past, my statements has always been like, look, that's like 35 years ago. Usually models don't stay constant for 35 years, but I'm not pointing out to like a very concrete reason why like we should really be concerned. And you point out to one that like no one would disagree with. So that levels up the argument. So, good. Any other questions?
I just had another. So I'm not sure if this is true, but I'm assuming that before this approach happened, didn't CFOs make their decisions on capital structure based on WACC minimization? And if on average they stuck to WACC minimization, wouldn't this give similar results?
So the answer is they don't all use WACC minimization. So to be clear. And in fact, we see that because I showed you guys a Six Flags exercise where Six Flags chose 27% and WACC said 20. Like this was real data. Like all the numbers I gave you were either exactly numbers or ballpark numbers for that point in time. So yeah, not everyone does it, right? But the ones that probably hire the investment banks probably got that as a calculation, right? But not everyone hires an investment bank to help them with these decisions. So not everyone trusts investment banks either, and not everyone. We can carve this in a whole bunch of different ways. Now, but the flip side is some do, right? Because some do, there's a little bit of rigging in that formula that is like pushing you a little bit towards WACC minimization, right? I mean, there's this kind of, maybe one funny way to say it is if everyone did WACC minimization, then this formula would come pretty close to giving us WACC minimization. The two techniques would be the same, right? That is a bit of a funny thing, right? Thankfully, that's not what happens in the real world. But that is a good point. It's fine. Oh, there was a funny paper that was an academic paper that was published once where I'm not going to tell you the names of the people, but it was like I was a PhD student at MIT at this time. And so we saw this presentation and like basically everyone laughed about it's a nice person, smart guy. It's just one of these things where you kind of lose sight of the big picture. Basically like the person was claiming that he had found a magical way to estimate the cost of capital of companies by looking at analyst reports where analyst reports were providing estimates of expected returns. Right? Oh, this analyst report, reports that, expected return should be, or the WACC should be this, right? And he's like, oh, well, why don't we use those numbers and use that like as our discount rate instead of using like all these, like really complicated asset pricing models. And then like, actually the person who asked the question was Stu Myers, who I mentioned last lecture for a pecking order theory, right? Stu is like, wait a second, like these analysts took our classes and we taught them the CAPM. Oh no, I still remember, like the person was all surprised at the end of his exercise And he was like, it's amazing. Like, we've got all these sophisticated models. And, like once I look at this data, like the CAPM is a really good model. It explains things much better than like Fama French 3-factor or adding a momentum thing. Okay, then this is worse too. It's like, but basically the only thing we've taught these analysts is the CAPM. So maybe this just means that they're using the CAPM. The person did not know what to say because the problem is that's probably exactly what's happening, right? Like, so he was saying like, he was doing a naive thing, right? Sometimes people say something and the first time you hear it, it makes sense. Then you think about it and it doesn't make sense. So he was basically making some leap of faiths that are that sound like things that are okay in general context, but when you dig under the hood, sometimes they're really bad, right? So he's like, analysts are experts. They know more about companies than us as external researchers, right? Because of that, they can estimate WACC better than us, better than we could ever do with a statistical model. Since we find it difficult to estimate an expected return in other ways, why don't we use their number and use that to test the validity of the CAPM, Fama French 3-factor, yada, 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 right? And now we can run a rat race between the models and we find who's the winner. You say that right away and it's like, well, everything here sounds sensible. Okay, let's see what happens, right? But like you now see like, well, they know a lot. They tend to know a lot about, nitty gritty operation stuff, stuff maybe related to cash flows. But the discount rate is not something that most people spend that much time thinking about. So most people just kind of do what they were taught. Right? How often do you hear Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett talk about the discount rate? No, every time they talk about stuff, they talk about things that really map more to cash flows than discount rates. Right? Experts are spending more time. By the way, this is another weird thing, is that you look at the experts, right? They spend all their time thinking about cash flows. And yet in your class, you spend a disproportionate amount of time thinking about discount rates. That's a little bit weird too. Yeah. I mean, part of the problem is teaching about cash flows is really difficult. It's like, it's not a one size fits all. It's literally a one size fits one, which makes it really difficult to teach, right? So there's some logic behind why things are the way they are, but it's a bit of a pity kind of thing. But anyway, I don't know how we started into this conversation, but this is, everything I just said is also not testable. But in any case, let's just call it a wrap or whatever. So, this ends our discussion of material for the course. I hope you guys found this stuff useful, both in terms of like potential applicability and also introducing broader themes than what is just solely relevant for the class that might be relevant to you guys for making qualitative decisions or mindful decisions in terms of knowing what you know, knowing what you don't know, thinking about how you want to continue to self-learn post McGill. So I hope some of those lessons have been absorbed as well. And I hope you guys have learned the technical material, both to be able to do that commodity skill in a way that you have to be able to do it in the real world, and in a way that helps you, have a semi happy experience on the upcoming exam. But look, in general, it's been a pleasure to teach you guys. I was very worried and dreading teaching online this semester. I think none of us really knew what to expect. I've actually ended up enjoying it. Having even just a few really eager, ambitious, and thoughtful students showing up at these live sessions makes a world of difference. I know, because I taught to an audience of 0 when I had to make the lectures on the fly, last winter. And I just remember how terrible that was. It was the worst work experience of my life. And it hasn't felt like that this semester. It's kind of felt like you guys have been here, right? So I appreciate that. And I also like appreciate not just for the live students, but the non-live students, all the feedback that you guys have provided. Honestly, it's helped me understand you guys better, which I think is actually now, I realize how important that is. I guess in the past, I would call myself product centric. I just wanted to teach you guys a lot of cool stuff. And now I feel like you guys have helped me become a little bit more customer centric. And to be honest, that's pretty important. And actually, you know what? You guys do pretty cool stuff. And I've learned some of the cool stuff that you guys do that I would have not learned before. And that's been actually a joy as well. So I thank you guys for that. Yeah, and hope, those of you who are, ambitious and really excited to continue to learn about things like that, don't hesitate to keep in touch. But just more generally, if I never see you guys again, I wish you all the best. Yeah, I wish you all the best. And there is going to be a final review session. That's going to be a marathon. Expect something to the order of 4 hours. I'll figure out when that's going to happen. Maybe it'll happen that week that I thought was not happening. So it seems like something that's freed up at this stage. Although I'm not even sure if I'm allowed to do that. I'll have to ask the BCom office. They do have rules. So I'll figure that out, but there will be one. The final review will be iron focused on the final. So I'm not going to be like going off on tangents where I say, oh, I'm thinking about this now. I'm going to just go and say it. It'll be to the point. And really just focused on like, this is testable. This is not testable. This would be representative of something testable this way. Here's, 3 examples of this type of problem. Here's 2 examples of that one. Let's go ahead and solve through those. And where every problem will be like introducing a slightly different wrinkle so that it's not just same thing over and over again, changing numbers, but it's giving you a feel of the different kind of nooks and crannies that you could have in these types of things. Sound good? Okie dokie. Yeah, so I think, so as I said, next Tuesday, no lecture. Next Thursday, I'll be here, but I'm not coming prepared with anything. It's just you guys have questions, come, ask away. Sound good? Okie dokie. Sorry, I went 5 minutes over.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is the show
Thank
value.
you.